So today, yes, as Oliver mentioned, I'm going to be talking about process theorizing, and it's going to be a short presentation. There will be three main parts to this short presentation. One, I will be talking about defining process theorizing and what it means to try and develop theory about process. Then we will get into a little bit on the methods behind process theorizing. And I'm really saying methods because there's multiple ways of building theory with processes. And then I'll provide some examples, some very short examples. And then we leave open the stage for questions. I look forward to discussions with all of you. So Oliver was already very generous about his introductions today. But I guess a couple of things that I'd like to highlight. I come from a European background, and especially at the time when I did my PhD, it was really all about big sociological theories. So we're talking about the large theories, and I was trained in qualitative methods. So a lot of my way of thinking about how to develop theory has been influenced by sociological theories and by qualitative methods. However, for the last 15 years, I have been fascinated by digital trace data. And these digital trace data really have forced me, enabled me, allowed me to really stretch out my methodological toolbox and to really force me to try and develop new ways of how to develop theory and especially process theorizing. So a lot of my research agenda today is really focused on theorizing digital technology related processes. So I could not be happier to have the opportunity to present to you today. So starting with a definition of process theorizing, one of the earliest definitions of process theorizing comes from Tsoukas, who talks about an explanation in terms of progression. So we're not interested in a snapshot. We're not interested in things that are at a certain moment in time or in different variables that are related to one another. Also, this is interesting, but we are interested in the sequence. We are interested in changes over time. So how change happens and how circumstances, what explains this change and how can we make sense of it. There are many different ways of thinking about process theorizing. The main distinction is between variant theory and process theory. We know this with Lawrence Moore since 1982 and even before, but really we are interested in the sequence of change. And there's multiple different types of theories about processes. There's multiple ways of thinking about it, but there's two key ways that have been highlighted: weak processes and strong processes. So when we're thinking in terms of a weak process, we're mostly interested in how things change from time 1 to time 2 to time 3. It's fairly linear, and we're mostly interested in changes over time. When we're thinking in terms of stronger processes, we're actually not necessarily interested in every single event independently of the others. We really are interested in the flow of things, in the changes of things. And weak process versus strong processes, depending on the topic you're interested in, depending on your own intellectual backgrounds and inclinities, you might actually be more interested in weak processes and strong processes. And strong process is not necessarily better than weak process, although it does sound like it. It's just a different way of thinking about a process, whereas a weak process is more the sequence of things, and a strong process is really thinking in terms of just, it's a river, the flow that we're constantly interested in. And when we're thinking about how to put together this process theorizing, what makes a process contribution, Cloutier and Langley provided some interesting insight in this regard. But we can see that the process can look very different. Given if we are interested in a weak process or a strong process, we can have very, very complex ways of representing and of theorizing a process. So it depends on the topic, it depends on the data, it depends on the analysis that are being provided, but there are multiple ways of representing and of theorizing different types of process. And obviously, a weaker process, a more linear process, is going to be a little easier to represent and to theorize than a strong process. One element that is of great importance to me is to think about, well, it's all very interesting, weak process, strong process, I get it, I see, but what I've always been particularly fascinated with is trying to make sense of, well, why do things change the way they do? Why do we have this particular moment X, and then at a later moment we have something else happening? What is explaining the process? In other words, what are the different motors of change? How can we think about process? And thinking about the motors of change is always useful when doing process theorizing. I cannot recommend enough as a Van der Ven and Poel very classic paper. I'm sure you've all read it. At some point I had memorized it almost entirely. It is a classic. It is well cited for a reason, because it really gets into, when we're thinking in terms of process, what different types of process are we going to be having, depending on the mode of change and the unit of change. So you can have a fairly simple sequential process, which is an evolution process, which will be having multiple entities related, and then you have variation, selection, retention, and you come back. It's at a population level. It's an evolution. And we see, we have many, in science, we have many theories of evolution, and it's very useful to think about what is powering the process. There's also a life cycle that is a fairly simple way of thinking about a process. So we have, from birth to death, and that can be the birth of an organization to the death of an organization, but it can be the birth of the development of a new technology to its implementation, to its use in multiple organizations. That's a life cycle process. And thinking in terms of life cycle can allow you to make sense of the data that you may have, because we're going to get into the data in a minute. But there are other processes that we have been using a little bit less, I think, in our disciplines of information systems and digital technology related disciplines. So there's a teleological process, which is a process about what is the goal and how is the goal, the outcome related to the goal, and are we making changes? So thinking in terms of what are the goal, how do we envision it, how do we implement it, and how do we make some correction? I have not seen many teleological processes in our scholarship. If you have and want to send me a note with examples, please do. And if this is something that resonates with you and you think you could make sense of it, I think there's a gap here. And the last motor of change that Van der Ven and Poel are highlighting is a dialectic one. So it used to not to be underrepresented in our disciplines, but I think there's a strong push now for more and more dialectic process. So I will not say it's underrepresented anymore. But the dialectic process is to think there's tensions. So there's a thesis, an antithesis, there's a conflict, and then this conflict needs to be resolved in some way, but this resolution might be just temporary. So we go back to the tension, etc., etc. It's a very good way of representing processes where there's conflict, where there's tension somewhere. The last point I will mention about this Van der Ven and Poel article, which for me was an inspiration, is the fact that they say that these 4 models of change are important and useful and can help make sense of processes, but they can also be combined. So you can have evolution with life cycle, you can have evolution with dialectic, you can have composite process theorizing. And I think by thinking about what is powering the change behind a process and thinking that there can be more than one, we can actually get into greater depth of theorizing. So this is why I'm mentioning this. So far I've been providing you with a lot of examples from classical Academy of Management review papers, very, very important papers. But it is important to note that our disciplines are recognizing the importance of processes. There's this amazing paper by Moussavi Beghi et al. On everything flows. This in MISQ, which was a next generation theory building papers special issue. This is a very good example of advocating for studying strong processes in the digital environment. And it's a very interesting example, especially because at the end, they give some little pieces of advice on how to do it. So if you have not read it, I'm sure you have, but if you have not, please consider going to this paper. It has a lot of very interesting things. And to me, it's an excellent example of advocating for a strong process to study digital technology related changes. Okay, so this is for the theory aspect of it. Now on to how to do this, how to conduct process theorizing, because this all well and good, but we want to be able to do it ourselves. One key element I would really want you to keep from this presentation today is that we can develop process theorizing from any kind of data, from multiple potential sources of data. You can develop process theorizing from semi-directed interviews, especially if you have done interviews at different moments in time, from participant observations. Ethnographers from time immemorials have used participant observations and have developed process theorizing. You could do surveys at different moments in time and think about how this changed. Obviously, archival data and documents are excellent sources of data to be able to trace the process and to theorize upon it. And digital trace data, which we will be focusing on a little bit more in a little bit. So there are so many sources of data. There's not just one single source of data that you can use in order to engage in process theorizing, which should come as a relief. There's just not one single way of doing process theorizing. There's multiple ways of doing so. There's multiple potential sources of data, as long, obviously, as the researcher can show temporality, can show evolution over time. If the data is only focused on one single moment in time, it will be a little bit more of a stretch to then make a case for process theorizing, right? So multiple potential sources of data, but some better suited than others. Now, in terms of how to make sense of a process and then getting into the theorizing, once again, going back to the classics, Langley, 1999, Strategies for Theorizing Process Data. So in this article, she mentioned many things, including a narrative strategy. So that's trying to create a narrative. This is what happens. We are creating something out of it. It's usually, the narrative strategy is usually one of the first things to do. It cannot be the end of the analysis process. It's usually one of the first elements in the analysis process, but it's an important one. Quantification strategy, I know a lot of researchers are particularly interested in trying to quantify, so trying to put different numbers for different stages in a process or for different elements associated with a process. It's a nice way to try and go beyond just a narration and try to be systematic with the data. It might not always be feasible depending on the data that you have. You can use grounded theory, which is, you're going to really trying to go from the data itself and do some back and forth with the theory. You could do some visual mapping, which is represent the processes, and then you might realize that as you map visually your process, you might realize, oh, it is a life cycle, or oh, it is a dialectic process, or it's something in between. So visual mapping is important. Temporal bracketing is really useful in process theory, especially in the weaker theories than the stronger theories, stronger process theories. But temporal bracketing means you have data from multiple time periods, and you're going to try and combine this data into different periods. And depending on how you put your data together, your process is going to be looking very different. So temporal bracketing is a good way of trying to reduce all of the information that you have. And I will give you an example of a temporal bracketing. And then you can also do computer simulations. Computer simulation can be excellent ways of representing and building theories from processes. So there's a lot that you can there's different strategies that you can use, and you can combine them. Usually narrative strategy is one of the first one because it's one where a lot of ideas emerge, but it cannot be all there is, and you can combine different ones in order to get deeper into your theorizing. Another element, so once you've employed all of your different strategies, another thing has to do with the conceptual leap. So I don't know if you've heard of this conceptual leap. It's a concept that is used fairly often, especially in organization theory, which is to say, well, we have all of this data, we've done all of this analysis, and now we need to get to the process theory itself. And going from the data to the analysis to the theory, you're going to do a little conceptual leap. If you have no conceptual leap, what happens is that your theory is just going to be very descriptive, and it's only going to be fitting the particular data that you have. So it's going to be a very low range theory. If your conceptual leap is too big, then the data and the analysis and the resulting theory do not connect. So the readers, the reviewers, the editors are not going to buy the theory that you build. So the conceptual leap is really important because you want it to be not too small because you don't have a contribution, and not too big because it's not credible. And so what Clark and Langley said in this very interesting article is, how do we get through this conceptual leap to make it the right size? I encourage you to take a look at it, but the key points to take a look at this article, and I can share everything if you want, of course. But the key point I wanted to make about this is that the conceptual leap is not necessarily only related to process theorizing, but it's especially important in process theorizing because we are very connected to the data, and we want to make sense of a process, and we want to build a theory that makes sense of processes, but that go beyond what we already know. So conceptual leap is very important. So now we are getting to the third part of my presentation, where I'm going to show you some examples. Not ideal examples by any stretch. It's just examples I know fairly well because I worked on them for very, very long. So an example of a process theorizing, fairly traditional in some ways and then innovative in another way, but traditional in some ways in the sense that it connects qualitative data to a process. Example of process theorizing. It's a paper that I wrote with Alain Pinsonneau on digital technology enabling and threatening occupational identity with a case of data scientists. And what really got me interested in this study was that data science and data scientists were becoming very, very interesting. And everybody was talking about them. You know, they were the sexiest job of the 21st century, according to HBR. So I'm not a data scientist, and I wanted to understand data science. So I started to look around, as we all do as researchers. We look around to see what we don't know. And I came across this online community of Data Science Central, which is still a very active online community that talked all about data science. And I started poking around the discussions, and I realized that the data scientists who participated in these discussions were having some real identity, existential identity issues in this online community. Even though everybody was saying that data scientists were the future of work, they were not convinced of this. And that, for me, that was an empirical puzzle. I wanted to make sense of it. So the study itself relied upon interviews, mostly to make sense, to make sure that what was happening in the online community and our interpretation of it was made sense to the people who participated in the community and to data scientists. But mostly the interviews were the trace data from the online community. So we collected 6 years of entries in the community to see what they talked about. We were interested in the identity, in the occupation, and to see how things evolved. So in terms of the data analysis, because we're interested in the process theorizing here, the data analysis was very iterative, and I engaged in temporal bracketing. So in order to be able to do this temporal bracketing on these 6 years of data, first, I did a theoretical sampling of particular episodes, because we had, if you take a look here, we had 9,300 blog posts, 600 threads, 3,000 posts associated with this. That was just too much. And not all of these posts, not all of these threads were relevant to the study. So one of the first things we had to do was to engage in theoretical sampling. And we identified 30 identity work episodes, which were episodes in which there were questions about who were data scientists, whether they would be surviving over time, what would happen to them. So 30 of them. And once we had these 30 identity work episodes, we engaged in a temporal bracketing. And so we had 6 years of data. And the temporal bracketing took a while, because at some point we had, I think, 6 periods, but then 6 periods you didn't have enough identity work episode in each, and it was too granular. And then at some point we had just 2 periods, and that was not granular enough. So we had to work with the temporal bracketing to make sense of what was happening. And so the key element I want to emphasize is that for process theorizing, it's really important to see what does make sense for the data, for the phenomenon, and for the theory that you're trying to build. And the resulting theory, the visual of the resulting theory is here. I will not go over the actual content of it because it's not necessary. So a couple of things for you to see. One, it's complex because we're dealing with a dialectical process, so it is going to be complex. You see the evolution over time. So for sure, it's you have a life cycle aspect to it. You see tensions, so it's dialectic. And you see how there's growth over time. So it is a process. So this paper for me is an example of a fairly traditional process theory paper with mostly qualitative data identified in ways that are fairly traditional. However, where I think it's fairly innovative is that it represents one of the first examples of a composite process. We're dealing with 2 different motors of change, and these 2 motors of change combine. And I think there is some interest in developing further composite process because it opens up more possibility for theorizing. So this is for the first example. And of course, I'd be happy to take any questions you have on this or anything else after the presentation. The second paper I wanted to present to you, it is much less traditional because it really deals with digital trace data and the potential of relying upon process mining to engage in process theorizing. So it's I've been very fortunate to work with Brian Pentland and Julie Ryan Wolf on this paper, where we were from the beginning. It's a paper with a very long history, and again, I'd be happy to share the history. But from the very beginning of this paper's history, we were interested in process theories, theorizing, and digital trace data. And we wanted to see potentials, limitations, opportunities, and how to help other researchers who are interested in similar topics, similar methods. And what we noticed was that actually when we're thinking in terms of what is process research, it's not just a single universe of process research. What we noticed was that there were two islands of process research, and actually there might be more islands that we don't know of, but at least we noticed two islands. The first island was the island of process theory. It's the island I am more by background, by training, I am much more familiar with. It's a theory focused one. It's the one I talked to you about at the beginning of the presentation. That's my initial focus. So building theory, usually with a practice perspective, understanding how changes happen, and we have different ranges of theories from mid-range to high theory. So all process theory. And this is more on the organization theory part of the disciplines. But there's an equally big, if we were to measure them, they would be equally big. There's an equally big island, the process mining one. And this process mining, it's business process management, it's operations management related. It is much more focused on methods. It has related upon methodological innovation with sophisticated methods, computational methods, and it relies essentially upon digital trace data. And where we saw an opportunity was that these two islands did not know one another very much. There was a couple of papers that we identified that made reference to the other island, but it was really not that much. So on the one hand, you have process theory with a lot of very interesting big ideas, but sometimes the data is a little lacking. And on the other hand, you have fantastic methods, great data, sophisticated models, but sometimes not really theorizing around it. So let's bring the two islands together. That's the key point of this paper. So there's a real opportunity to use digital trace data and to engage in process theorizing. So a key point of this paper is to represent process as graphs. So we have vertices with events, you have edges with sequence of events, and you're going to be representing processes with vertices and edges. And you can see on the right side of the slide, this is just one day at a dermatology clinic with multiple events, and you have different processes taking place. If you can make sense of this, fantastic. We could not, and that was kind of the point. Because the idea behind this was to say, well, we have all of this data, we have all of these ways of representing the processes, and there is something happening, there is change happening. We can make sense of this change without necessarily reducing it beforehand. We can reduce it afterwards, but we can take advantage of all the data that we have and all of these innovative computational methods in order to try and represent a process and then theorize upon it. So we really try to bring together to analyze, explain, predict. So this is a Shirley Greger's theorizing aspect of it. But we're trying to bring together the theories with example of process dynamics that look very messy. So how can we do this? How can we try and bring everything together? Well, the element is to say, well, we're going to use the methods from business process management. So we're going to use process mining with different type of representation of processes, but we're still going to keep in mind the resulting theories that we'd like to see, right? So we're still engaging in theory development. It's not just about representing and giving a snapshot of different process. We're going to theorize it. And really what we want to be able to say, and we want to be able to identify things that do make sense. So we're going to see what's going to happen is we have lots and lots of data. Some data might be looking like noise. some data might be looking like signal, but as researchers, we do not want to choose right away what is signal and what is noise. We want to be able to make sense of the processes along the way and use as many data as we can. And so we can compare different processes over time. So we have a lot of flexibility. We can try and explain what changes, what doesn't change. There is still the question of conceptual leap. You still have it, it's still there, but you're using this methodological innovation of the process mining to be able to try and make sense of a process and theorize the process. So we are getting to my very last slide about a few key takeaways, if you will. Process theorizing can and does build upon multiple data and methods. So there's not just one single way of engaging in process theorizing. However, what makes a theoretical contribution still matters with process theorizing. So theory construction as a disciplined imagination is a very nice through line. I have it everywhere in my office. It is very important to keep thinking in terms of disciplined imagination. Rigor and creativity go together. They're very important. You cannot have one without the other. Temporality is important in process theorizing, but just because you're representing change over time does not mean necessarily that you have enough of a process theory. So it's not, temporality is not all there is in a process. Trying to make sense of why and how the process evolves is very important. Digital trace data open new possibility for process theorizing, undoubtedly. With this new possibility also, though, come potential constraints, and I know it from my own research. Being able to describe in great depth a process is not the same thing as theorizing it. And bringing theoretical meaning to digital trace data and deciding what is signal and what is noise is really important when it comes to digital trace data. It's also fairly tricky, fairly difficult. And finally, thinking about why and how processes evolve, change the ways they do is really critical. This is how you can really build theory about process. And with these few takeaways, that will conclude my presentation. Please send me an email, follow me or connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to keep in touch. But I'd be more than happy to take any questions you have.